Today, we're going to review a short video from the YouTube channel Red Pen Logic. Now, the channel Red Pen Logic is hosted by this fellow with the ball cap, Jesus is King. His name is Tim Barnett, although he goes under the moniker Mr. B on the channel. Red Pen Logic as a channel is affiliated with the conservative Christian apologetics ministry Stand to Reason. On the other hand, we have Brandon Robertson. And so Brandon Robertson is here sporting a red button-up shirt. He is a well-known social media influencer, I should say, and pastor, young pastor and author. And Robertson posts, so far as I can see, and I don't follow his career closely by any means, but so far as I can see, he posts a lot of sort of provocative, pithy things on social media, TikTok, and so on. And I often see conservative Christian apologists like Tim Barnett or Mike Winger or others engaging with Brandon Robertson's little clips because they're provocative and pithy, and engaging with them because Brandon Robertson represents himself, identifies as a progressive Christian. I find that a lot of the analysis or critical engagement with him from conservative Christian apologists almost is framed as sort of representing widely held, if not universally held, opinions among progressive Christians, which of course it's not. It's kind of like selecting a clip from John MacArthur and treating that as representative of evangelicals, which just makes no sense. And I'm not claiming that Tim Barnett necessarily does that here, although I will say that a lot of people who watching this video would come away with the impression that the way that Brandon Robertson reads the Bible is just generally how progressive Christians read the Bible, which again, this certainly is not. Having said that, I'm not here to critique Brandon Robertson or to critique whether he represents progressive Christians or not. What I want to critique is the way that I think Tim Barnett fundamentally misrepresents and misunderstands what Brandon Robertson is doing in this short 1-minute TikTok video. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to watch the first minute of Barnett's video, which consists of Barnett watching Brandon Robertson's TikTok video. So think about this. You're watching me watching Barnett watching Robertson, which is kind of an interesting thing going on. Then I'm going to pause and just for a minute, just kind of debrief what we've just viewed. And then we're going to play about a minute or so of Mr. B then debriefing and critiquing Robertson. Then we'll pause it and I'll offer my critique of his critique of Robertson. Okay, let's get started.
Did you know that Jesus helped his friend come out? In John chapter 11, verse 43, this is what it says. Jesus called out in a loud voice saying, "Lazarus, come out." You see, Lazarus was locked up in a cold, dark tomb, wrapped in burial cloths, left for dead. That's exactly what so many Christians and so many churches do to LGBT people. They wrap us up and bind us up and tell us that we need to keep our identity, our true self locked away. But Jesus, upon seeing Lazarus in this state, he says, "Lazarus, come out. Step into the light. Take off the cloth. Be who you are. Come alive." I believe that this is what Jesus is speaking to every LGBT person. Come out of the tomb of shame. Take off the chains that have bound you up. Step into the glory of who God made you to be, fearfully and wonderfully made, just as you are. You are beloved of God.
This is a great example of.
Okay, so sorry to pause, but so I just want to debrief. So what we've just viewed here is a 1-minute TikTok video from Brandon Robertson, where he's talking about the pericope of Lazarus coming back from the dead in the Gospel of John, and describing how this applies to, as he sees it, the LGBT community. Now we're going to get the debrief from Mr. B, where he's going to offer his critical engagement with what Brandon Robertson has said. And he's going to argue that Brandon Robertson has confused exegesis and eisegesis. So here is the floor now to Mr. B.
How not to read the Bible. Here's why. There are two ways to approach the Bible: eisegesis and exegesis. I know those are weird words, but stick with me because this is really important. There's a common interpretive error known as eisegesis. The word eisegesis just means to lead into. Basically, the reader injects his own ideas into the text, making it mean whatever the reader wants. On this view, the author's intended meaning doesn't matter. The opposite and proper approach, however, is known as exegesis. The word exegesis literally means to lead out of. Here, the reader is led to the author's intended meaning by following the text. This often requires careful analysis of the Bible. So there's two different approaches to studying Scripture. The first reads his own meaning into the text, that's bad, while the second reads the author's meaning out of the text, that's good. Now, which do you think is going on in this video? Clearly, Robertson is starting with his own modern meaning and attempting to force fit it into this ancient text. How do we know? Well, to come out is a modern English idiom.
Okay, so I think we can pause it there. So Barnett is now saying, so there are these two distinctions: exegesis, reading out of the text, the meaning that is there, and eisegesis, projecting onto the text the meaning that you want to find there. And he accuses Brandon Robertson of engaging in eisegesis. Now, I think that the basic definitions, basic categories that Tim Barnett has identified here are correct. I agree with his definitions. The problem is his analysis of Brandon Robertson, because in fact, I think Brandon Robertson is not doing what Tim Barnett is doing. And so the irony, the great irony, is that Tim Barnett is critiquing Brandon Robertson of reading the Bible incorrectly, when I think, in fact, Tim Barnett is reading Brandon Robertson incorrectly. And if he claims Brandon Robertson is projecting a meaning onto the biblical text that isn't there, I'm going to argue that, in fact, he is projecting a meaning onto Brandon Robertson that isn't there. What do I mean by that? Well, just as we want to distinguish between exegesis and eisegesis, we also want to distinguish between reading the Bible and preaching the Bible. Or to put it another way, between exegesis of the text and hermeneutical proclamation of the text. Think about any sermon, not any sermon, but your typical good sermon. Your typical good sermon begins with exegesis of a text. Right? The preacher is explaining what the biblical author is saying here, and what God ultimately is saying, because God's voice may not be exactly the same as the biblical author's voice, but that's a little bit of a sidebar, admittedly. But you're preaching the text. What does the text mean in its original meaning? But a sermon doesn't stop with reading the Bible. A sermon must go to preaching the Bible, proclaiming the Bible, the hermeneutical application, or as we often say colloquially, the so what. What does this mean for us today? We know what the original author meant. We know what maybe God meant in the original text, but what does it mean for us today? And that's the preaching part. That's the so what part. That's the application part. Now, a 1-minute TikTok video, in this case, I think it's pretty clear that on the most charitable and reasonable interpretation of what Brandon Robertson is doing, that he's not actually engaged or intending to do exegesis of the text. I mean, I think it's a little bit patently absurd on the face of it to claim that what he's arguing is that in the original pericope, Lazarus is coming into his gay identity, that this is somehow an allegory for Lazarus recognizing that he's gay. I mean, because that seems, so far as I can understand, to be what Mr. B is claiming Brandon Robertson is claiming, that it's a story about Lazarus coming out and saying he's in fact gay. I mean, that's not a reasonable and charitable interpretation of what Brandon Robertson is doing. He's not exegeting the text, or attempting to. And so he can't be guilty of eisegeting the text or projecting his meaning into the text. Instead, what he is doing in this short video is engaged in proclamation, in the so what. So he's not dealing with what does the text mean back then, but he's dealing simply in a 1-minute TikTok video with what does it mean for us today. And today, for an LGBT audience, he's saying the text can, part of the implications or the meaning of the text for us today is it can be a model, an inspiration, a framework for understanding how God is calling each one of us into our true identity. And if you are same-sex attracted, then that's the true identity and the life into which God is calling you. Now, if you're not a gay affirming, of course, you're not going to find that to be a legitimate hermeneutical application of the original meaning of the text. That's fine. The problem, however, is don't then go and misrepresent what Brandon Robertson is doing. When he's attempting to preach the text, don't say that he's simply trying to do exegesis and then accuse him of doing eisegesis, because that was never, I think, his intent. And so you don't defeat or critique other people like a progressive influencer like Brandon Robertson by misrepresenting what they are doing in a short 1-minute TikTok video. And you certainly don't accuse them of misrepresenting another text by misrepresenting their text on social media.